Hi, if you read in the program, it says, I teach landscape architecture at the University of Oregon. I've done that for the last 45 years. But like Larry Halprin, I grew up in Brooklyn, which accounts for the accent.
What accent?
Just like yours. Several years ago, the Library of American Landscape History decided that they were going to do a series of books on modern American landscape architects, and Halpern, of course, was one of them. So the book you're looking at the cover of is the second comprehensive book that deals with Larry Halpern's career. The first comprehensive book is his own autobiography, which I highly recommend, which sadly was published posthumously. I was asked to write about his book because I had previously written about his work in Israel, where I've been teaching intermittently since 1980 and knew that work very well. So what this talk does is summarize material that's in the book. You're going to hear a lot more about specific projects, specifically specific California projects by other speakers today. So things I'm going to talk about, we'll just introduce them. Firstly, how many people have been to the FDR Memorial? How many people have been to Freeway Park? How many people have been to Sea Ranch? How many of you have a place at Sea Ranch? Very good. How many have been to Portland to see Halperin's fountains? Okay. How many of you made a special trip to see any of those things? Okay, so, all right. Case closed, I don't need to talk anymore. What your answers do is demonstrate the canonical aspect of Halperin's work. To me, the mark of a great designer is an individual who responds to the passions and issues of their time, knows and understands places, and has the skill and imagination to employ that knowledge. So I want to talk about one such designer, Larry Halprin, and try to put his work into the context. Let me see if these things are working. Yep. Nope. The other way. Okay. Okay. Into the context of his place and times. All American landscape architects are indebted to Frederick Law Olmsted. In the second half of the 20th century, I think Larry Halprin could lay claim to being the updated heir to that venerated designer and public figure. He embodies the most essential characteristics of his legacies. Olmsted's great achievement, along with other 19th century founders of the profession of landscape architecture, was the wedding of three ideas. First, the application of 19th century aesthetics, English landscape design principles adapted to North America. Second, the aesthetic principles were combined with a deep understanding of the significance of nature. Olmsted profoundly believed that contact with the natural world was beneficial and an uplifting moral and ethical force. Third, and perhaps most important, this aesthetic and philosophy was embedded with a social purpose, a reform agenda that evolved into the progressive era. This triad of an aesthetic response to nature combined with social purpose is at the heart of the profession of landscape architecture. Larry Halpern reaffirmed and even extended this when he said, "Landscape design is about social relevance. It can become poetic and symbolic, but perhaps most importantly, it can articulate a culture's most spiritual values." Like Olmsted, Halpern's career is characterized by his engagement with the arts, passions, and actions of his time. As a young man, this included his commitment to the great Zionist experiment, the founding of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. World War II was the formative experience of his generation, and as a designer responding to post-war America, a place of growing affluence, development, suburbanization, and urban renewal. Halpern engaged the project types of his day: the suburban shopping mall, the freeway, urban reclamation and revitalization of city centers, adaptive reuse of places, and the beginnings of ecological design. He was born in 1960, and as I said, raised in Brooklyn. He attended private high school and excelled as an athlete. Upon graduation, he spent 2 years in Israel and returned to the States to study plant sciences. While studying for a PhD at the University of Wisconsin, he met and married Anna Schulman, who was a dancer. On her suggestion, they visited Frank Lloyd Wright's Taliesin East, sparking interest in architecture. But a visit to the library led him to Christopher Tunner's book, Gardens in the Modern Landscape. That place and book were both epiphanies and influenced his decision to become a landscape architect. He was soon attending Harvard's Graduate School of Design. This was only a few years after the school's modern, what they called revolution, that had replaced traditional Beaux-Arts curriculum with a Bauhaus education. While that program did not include landscape architecture, its philosophy of interdisciplinary work had a profound impact on him. He returned to Israel, but World War II interceded, and he joined the Navy, where at the Battle of Okinawa, a kamikaze plane hit his destroyer. The Navy had taken him west, and at war's end, he sought work in San Francisco, which is emerging then as the post-war decades as the American Center for Landscape Design Innovation. These formative personal and educational experiences were the foundations of his career. A grounding in the world of plants and science, the excitement and promise of modernist design and the profession of landscape architecture, the collaborations with Anna and her career as a choreographer and dancer, and a response to the times and places in which she lived. She described that this is her favorite photograph of the two of them. In a career that spanned 6 decades, he continued to evolve and respond to new influences, and both personal and professional. Yet there were places that were touchstones: Israel, the Sierras, Sea Ranch, and his home, places and experiences that he often returned to for inspiration and solace. Israel was the first. His personal relationship with the land and state of Israel lasted almost 80 years. He came from a deeply committed Zionist family. He had spent 2 years in Israel, as I mentioned, as a youth, most importantly being involved with a group of people who would establish a kibbutz, which were then in their pioneering, idealistic, experimental stage of communal social life. On numerous visits, he returned to the kibbutz and to Jerusalem, to which he developed a special affection. All the drawings you're going to see here are his. Most are from the 127 notebooks which he kept for over 50 years, which are now archived at the University of Pennsylvania. Only a very small portion of which have been published. They're absolutely, when I was researching this, I was in archive heaven. He reveled in the city's qualities and what he called the cacophony of life all around. He wrote, "Israel and Jerusalem have affected my life ever since. My value systems and my attitudes have been deeply influenced by Israelis' reverence for the land, the profound social consciousness, and their sense of community that affected me. All have become part of my life's choreography." Israel was close to his heart, but the other landscapes were closer to his California home and exemplified the cross-section of the state from the rugged Pacific shore to the crest of the Sierra. Both of these landscapes are truly sublime, where nature's power and magnificence is a dramatic presence. Sea Ranch was the site of his great experiment in ecological design, you'll hear more about this later, and where he built a cabin. 200 miles to the east is it's the east of Sea Ranch are the Sierra Nevada mountains. Hiking in this terrain, Halpern discovered what he called the Gardens of the High Sierra. It was his astute observation and recognition that gardens are created by the acts of the mind as well as the hand, and that in the unadorned and unadulterated forms of nature, there were gardens, places of beauty, delight, and wonder. In these gardens, he saw evidence of how natural processes had created these places, and that process and product were integral. He even called them synonymous. In this high country, he saw how, he wrote, the powerful yet refined order of nature opened up a vast aesthetic territory that transformed my basic approach to design. Well, between the Sierras and the Pacific was his daily California landscape that also exerted its powerful influence. The omnipresent touchstone of his home, which had been designed by the architect William Worcester, located in Marin County on the slopes of Mount Tamalpais and embedded in a forest of redwood, madrone, and oak just over the bridge from San Francisco, where he worked for 60 years. His daily life oscillated between the poles of this semi-wild landscape of his home and the urban environment. Halpern's career went through many well-defined phases, any one of which would have confirmed his significance as a designer. His first job was with the California landscape architect Tommy Church. Church had been trained in the Beaux-Arts tradition, but he added to that an eclectic modernist sensibility. In practice, though, was noted for his sympathetic response to the particularities of site and client, the succinct message carried in the title of his book, Gardens Are for People. Halpern learned that lesson well. His final His final work in the office, the Donnell Garden, and you'll see pictures of that. I'm looking at one right now. The Donnell Garden in Sonoma is recognized as one of the landmarks of modern design. It's a studied composition of a sinuous biomorphic swimming pool whose curves echo the distant view across the field and salt marshes. Soon after its completion in 1949, Halpern established his own office in San Francisco. Throughout the 50s, the work was predominantly residential, continuing the tradition of the church office. He in fact designed over 300 gardens, private gardens, mostly early in his career. Like many designers, his earliest work was for family members. In 1948, for his Schumann in-laws, he designed their garden south of San Francisco. At his home in California, the conventional California deck took on a different life as what became known as the dance deck, designed for Anna's performances and teaching. In the dance world, it became a famous stage and ultimately a pilgrimage site for dancers and choreographers. The deck was the site of the first workshops they did together. Larry Halpern didn't dance, but often watched the rehearsals and performances and constantly drew them. It's fair to say that many of Halpern's ideas and methods were developed while working on the deck and in the Halpern home. The Kegel Garden, 1950, helped put Halpern on the design map. It was published nationally and, in fact, internationally. It was the only illustration in a House Beautiful article entitled, "The Garden of the Next America is an Outdoor Room." That idea of the outdoor room was one of the central tenets of West Coast garden design. While small in area, the garden was a geometric composition, 4 perfect circles, an artful exercise of a barbecue, a fire pit, a pool, a fountain, and a composition in stones. The depth to the biomorphic forms of Miro, clay, and art was clear. The McIntyre Garden, done after in 1958, is set in a clearing in a eucalyptus forest. The architect was Joseph Escherich, whose home, in fact, Halpern had designed his garden. Its depth to Spanish gardens, especially the Alhambra, is clear. His office at the base of Telegraph Hill sported a roof deck, as did the nearby Simon Roof Garden, where he experimented with a modular design and a composition of stone and gravel. These last three gardens were all illustrated in the Museum of Modern Art's exhibit, Gardens in the Modern Landscape, which was critical. This residential work helped establish his reputation and attract clients for larger projects, and the practice expanded beyond residential design. With Worcester, they conceived and developed a community housing cluster in Berkeley known as Greenwood Common, 8 homes clustered around a common area. And Halpern would go on to design the individual gardens of 5 of those homes. In 1961, he was the landscape architect for a multifamily housing project in San Francisco at St. Francis Square, a groundbreaking, affordable, racially integrated cooperative housing project. And like many of the projects of the era, it was a product of urban renewal. But post-document studies said, and still say, that in fact, the site plan fostered social interaction, an especially good place for children. His first book, Cities, in 1963, more than a half century ago, set out an agenda. Its message was explicit. How can we make places that are equal to those that he'd visited, photographed, and drew, especially at travels in Europe? He exhorted that a city, he said, should provide a creative environment for people to live in, with freedom of choice, generating a maximum of interaction between people and their urban surroundings. To create these conditions was the designer's task, using what he called the basic materials of urbanism. His impact as a formal innovator is dramatically represented in the design of city spaces, but there's more. He wrote, "What we are really searching for is a creative process, a constantly changing sequence where people are generators, their creative activities are the aim, and the physical elements are the tools." In this prescient statement, Halpern laid out qualities that would ultimately be embodied in his RSVP methodology. In the 1960s, he made the leap into the public arena and the next and most exciting stage of his development. In a few short years, the office would acquire a national reputation for innovation, quality, and engage a full range of project types, most with an urban focus. The Bay Area was the epicenter of a period of dramatic cultural and social changes in America, what we now refer to as the 60s. Larry and his wife Anna engaged many of these developments and absorbed others: the human potential movement, the counterculture, environmental psychology, urban revitalization and preservation, environmentalism and ecology. While this was largely a youth movement, they embraced its tenets with a verve. As a slightly older statesman, he engaged in its ritual rites and changing attitudes towards work, sex, drugs, and convention. His designs attempted to infuse places with the democratic and participatory ethic of the era. At Berkeley, he in fact had designed Sproul Plaza, the stage for the birth of Berkeley's free speech movement in 1964. In the 60s and 70s, the heyday of the Halperin Office in its first incarnation, it was truly a trailblazing enterprise. In his own 1969 history of the office, he claimed, "Because of the design talent and insistence on quality and follow-through, this is the greatest landscape office on earth." He was not humble. It was a bold and immodest claim, but for a time, it was in fact a reasonable evaluation. I was in school at the time. This was the office that people looked to for innovation and where landscape architects aspired to work. The earliest forays were commercial. In 1956, the shopping center was a new building type, an old orchard in Skokie, suburban Chicago. Here he would give it his stamp, a group of buildings clustered around a series of outdoor spaces that he described as shopping gardens. Elements of the plan resembled the sinuous curves and patterns of Burle Marx's planting designs, which were well known at the time. A few years later, Halpern and Worcester collaborated again on a different kind of commercial environment: the landmark preservation and transformation of the Ghirardelli chocolate factory into Ghirardelli Square. Typical of American ports, San Francisco waterfront underwent dramatic changes in the 50s. Derelict warehouses, factories, canneries were being demolished. Ghirardelli Square was the first successful adaptive reuse in the United States and a landmark in both preservation and urban design. It was a resounding economic and social success and became the prototype for scores of rehabilitations, preservation projects, and festival marketplaces. There was another inspiration, for the work was clearly European. It was an early American excursion into a cultural shift that would revitalize street life and give attention to the design of streets as public spaces and really introduce the now commonplace outdoor cafe to the American landscape. Surely these changes can't be credited to Halpern, but his work epitomized it, and California was the locus of this transformation. The steeply sloped site was transformed into 5 levels of shops and restaurants built around a series of interconnected plazas. He said about Ghirardelli Square, it was, in a sense, a prototype of what a city could be like. The office's main emphasis was in the realm of urban design. In the 60s, the American cities was in crisis. Urban renewal, despite good intentions, was seen as a failure. Suburbanization was rampant. City life was often seen as undesirable and dangerous. Going against the grain, he wrote, "We believe that existing cities are salvageable, but require enormous effort to reconstitute. In this, they require the participation of the people who live in them, and we involve ourselves deeply in their interaction as well as the physical environment." One response was the creation of outdoor pedestrian malls. Despite good intentions, most failed. Halpern's did not. Several factors made Nicollet Mall in Minneapolis unique. Most important, it was not conceived as purely pedestrian, but it was in fact the nation's first transit mall, giving improved environment for pedestrians, but it also accommodated buses and taxis, but no cars. It was a total design. Halpern designed a panoply of urban streetscape elements that he had cataloged in his book Cities. Specific designs for lighting, bollards, benches, street signs, traffic signals, drains, and planters. And in fact, it was also his most comprehensive use of what he described as a notation system, a graphic notation to describe movement. The mall received national attention and became a prototype for other transit malls. The Portland Mall, with the successor to his firm designed. He designed a mall, downtown pedestrian mall in Charlottesville, and also one in Jerusalem. In 1967, in concert with the construction of BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, he began plans for the redesign of San Francisco's Market Street. The plan gave continuity to the street through widened sidewalks, street tree planting, and a unified material plan. The street terminated near the Embarcadero, now called the Justin Herman Plaza, a vast brick plaza clearly inspired by Italian piazzas. He said the plaza is a theater for events to happen. As a centerpiece, Halpern outlined the concept for an interactive fountain with the possibility of walking behind it, like the Avada fountain at Villa d'Este that he knew well. In the 1960s, California was a national leader in educational innovation. He designed several college campuses. The newly 1965 University of California at Santa Cruz wanted a distinctive campus design to support its unique educational program, an innovative concept of cluster colleges modeled, in fact, on Oxford and Cambridge. The UCSC colleges were embedded in a redwood forest on a steeply sloping hill overlooking a grand meadow and distant views to the city of Santa Cruz and the Pacific. He planned all of the connective tissue in this campus, and the character and design of each of the series of colleges was distinct, and in fact, Halpern was the landscape architect for the first three. I think there's now 10 or 12. Courtyards and quadrangles wrap around and frame the existing second-growth redwood groves that tower over the buildings. The final quad leads to Stevenson Grove Knoll, a bulbous mound that you see here, crowned by redwoods, that offers one of the college's most dramatic views. Where Halpern, though, was a true innovator was the design of the public fountain. In a series of designs in Portland, Oregon, Seattle, San Francisco, Denver, Fort Worth, Rochester, he conceived and reimagined the design of the fountain and the character of American civic spaces. At Seattle Center, he designed a master plan for the World's Fair, 62, and its subsequent transformation into a park and cultural center. Many great historic water gardens derive from the geometry of systems of irrigation. So too what was called the water sprinkler, but here using the contemporary technology of agricultural irrigation equipment in a novel way. Subsequent water gardens, though, employed the concrete forms of the city. In Portland, he designed the open space system for the urban renewal district that featured a progression of spaces, including two grand civic fountains, Lovejoy Plaza and Forecourt, now known as Iris Fountain. These were true innovations, radical reconceptions of the urban fountain, both in form and function, inspired by his study of water in the Sierras. But in lieu of imitating those environments, the fountains abstracted their forms in concrete. These were conceived of as places of performance, where people were permitted, even encouraged, to participate. He'd written, "The essential purpose of design is to create the possibility for events to happen." In a bit of hyperbole, but as an indicator of their importance and excitement they created at the time, Ada Louise Huxtable, who was architecture critic of the New York Times, said that Forecourt Fountain was one of the most important urban spaces since the Renaissance. Two dramatic fountains were simultaneously urban waterfall, plaza, and water garden. They were strikingly imaginative innovations that were a catalyst for conceiving new possibilities for civic spaces. His design philosophy gleaned principles from the natural world, but not in mimicry or replication. If the 19th century park was a rus in urbe, fragments of rural nature in the city, these were natura in urbe, abstractions of a more wild nature in the city. Portland offered Halpern the opportunity to transform his observations of the water and rock gardens of the High Sierra into civic spaces. The Sierra drawings, in fact, had been field research. They were studies in what he called the ecology of form that became the concept drawings for the fountain. Lovejoy's a grand environmental sculpture of terraced concrete constructed of a module of conventional 2x4s. From its upper level, a basin acts as a spring as water bubbles up from below and overflows into a basin, into falls, literally a cascade of stepped zigzag angular forms. The water gushes, sprays, glides, flows, and spurts. It's clearly a waterfall, but demonstrably a construction. Unlike the brutalism of many architects of the age, Halpern's use of concrete proved to be inviting, not repelling. Forecourt Fountain, built 4 years later, encompasses an entire 200 by 200 foot Portland city block. It was framed by dense plantings. On the upper plaza, on the upper plaza, water emerges from beneath the pavement as if springs were excavated beneath the city's surface. Channels with pebble surfaces that suggest tributaries line rectilinear pools and platforms as the water trickles over small cascades suggestive of rapids. Then, like a mountain stream, the water abruptly spills over monolithic concrete blocks into the basin below. 13,000 gallons of water per minute form great sheets of water. It is dramatic, loud, and for first-time visitors, it's mesmerizing, for it's an unexpected sight in the city. It's an ever-changing display facing the city auditorium. Following in the footsteps of the Portland projects was the development of Seattle's Freeway Park. Interstate highways had eviscerated American cities, literally slicing through their fabric. Halpern bemoaned the devastation they inflicted, and Freeway Park was built over 10 lanes of highways. At the heart of Freeway Park are two fountains, two water features, again, a central plaza cascade and the canyon. The cascade area is a series of low-level blocks easily climbed and essentially a wading pool. The unique canyon looks as if it was constructed out of a giant set of kids' blocks. The core of the canyon is in fact directly built over the highway median and descends down to the level of the roadway. I just drove here this morning from my son's house in Redondo Beach through miles and miles of freeways and imagining ways that they might have been transformed. People lie on the concrete blocks and dangle their feet over the edges, an element of danger that he desired as part of the experience. Once again, he was a trailblazer. Freeway Park was the first park built on air rights over an interstate. It was the beginning of what in fact now is modeled in other places. In Denver, he looked to the Rockies for inspiration for Skyline Park. Like Portland, it was a central element in an urban renewal scheme. In the dried high desert landscape, it was intended as a linear oasis inspired by Colorado's landscape of arroyos and sandstone foothills. Noticed by few visitors, the park could also function as a stormwater detention basin, now a common design concern, but rarely addressed at the time. Heritage Park in Fort Worth, Texas, is a remarkable design, but unfortunately became neglected and fell into disrepair. The plan is a set of overlapping rectangles that gently slope down in a succession of spaces from the downtown to a bluff overlooking the Trinity River. Inside the enclosure are water channels that slice through green terraces planted with live oaks. The final terrace is inscribed in space as an elevated walk above the wooded hillside that captures the wild landscape. The concept is a classic design progression from city to countryside, but quintessentially modern. While the city was his primary concern, he directed his energies to a broader arena. In the early 60s, he was involved in a landmark collaborative project that you're going to hear a lot more about later, which was Sea Ranch. He used a deep ecological analysis to make the bridge between landscape planning considerations and design criteria, creating a unique design vocabulary for the project. He began by immersing himself in the place, walking the entire 10-mile stretch of the 5,000-acre site and camping on the property. He made dozens of drawings ranging from detailed renderings of rocks and plants to sketches exploring its entire expanse. His methodology was encaptured in what he called an eco-score diagram, a logarithmic spiral timeline. He said that his goal was to inhabit this land and protect the awesome character without altering or softening it. The final proposal identified and addressed a series of zones. Nothing was to be built on the bluffs along the seashore, access points provided, views to the sea unobstructed. On the ocean terrace, buildings were either to be clustered or embedded in the hedgerows and keeping the meadows as great outdoor rooms and common lands. Halpern would build his own cabin at Sea Ranch, and when the guidelines suggested not building on the bluff, he built his on the bluff, choosing what was described as maybe the most beautiful site on the ranch. The view through the pines is a variegated seashore of rock outcrops that he drew so often. From Halperin Sea Ranch home, nature... Yeah, okay, drew so often. From his home, nature surveyed at its most powerful and primordial. It was the site of their first experimental workshops. Sea Ranch became perhaps best known, and I think probably best built example of what the landscape architect Ian McHarg had exhorted for individuals to design with nature. There was a self-consciousness about the design process that's central to Halperin's work and legacy, and it's grounded in his unique collaboration with his wife, the dancer Anna Halpern. From Anna, Larry adapted and adopted the language of dance as the dominant metaphor to describe his process, work, and aspiration. He continually spoke of scores, performance, choreography, motion, and dance itself. In Cities, the book he'd written, the city comes alive through movement and its rhythmic structure, where the urban elements are animated and contribute to the choreography of the city. His most articulate and consistent statement of his design process was articulated in what he called the RSVP cycles: resources, scores, value, action, and performance. He appropriated the word scores from the worlds, obviously, of the performing arts and dance. He expanded its meaning to include any representation, especially graphic, that determine a performance. Of the letters P, the performance was the goal, what he aspired to in his impact as a designer. He'd earlier written, "What I want to design is events which occur, which have no necessary or recognizable forms, but which generate qualities of experience, a presentation of alternatives, and ultimately decision-making and judgment." His attention to the graphic dimension of scoring's not surprising, because he had written earlier, "People think in different ways, and I find that I think most effectively graphically, and also that my thinking is influenced a great deal by my ability to get it down where I can look at it and think about it further. The process of thinking makes me generate more thinking." In 1966 and 68, Larry and Anna offered a series of memorable joint workshops known as the Experiments in the Environment. Initially, a month-long series of events occurred at their home in Marin County, Sea Ranch, and in San Francisco. Significantly, a domestic, a wild, and an urban setting. The participants were dancers, designers, and artists. What began as experimental workshops evolved into a method that engaged clients and ultimately entire communities in a process he called Take Part, his short term for a participatory process. Ultimately, the process was employed at a city scale. The publicity surrounding these had enormous impact and helped promulgate the idea and method. Many of the techniques, in fact, became common professional practice. By 1970, the office had expanded to 50 individuals. A decade earlier, it had about 10. The office brochure included the group photo you see at the left, and then a parallel nude photograph, which wasn't in the office brochure, but was perhaps surely a testament to the times. The gathering belied problems. Reflecting the times, there was a general atmosphere of resistance towards any hierarchical organization, epitomized in a design firm, and many of our parted design firms composed of principals, associates, and workers. He had supported changes in the firm's structure, but ultimately opted out and the office dissolved. He founded for a short time something known as Roundhouse, made a film about Salvador Dali, but in this period his real effort was the design of the FDR Memorial, and you'll hear more about this later as well. In one sense, it was one of his last great water environments. For Halperin's generation, FDR was the president. For Halpern to be chosen to design the memorial was beyond the dramatic, civic, and patriotic aspect of the work. It was something personal. He labored on the project for almost a quarter century. The design was substantially completed by 1978, construction began in 91, and it wasn't dedicated till 1997. It's located on the tidal basin along with the Jefferson Memorial and the Martin Luther King Memorial, with distant views of the Washington Monument. In this ceremonial ensemble, the memorial remains hidden until you approach it. It doesn't have that grand beckoning presence. It needs to be entered to be experienced. The memorial is structured as a progression through 4 rooms representative of the 4 terms of FDR's presidency. Halpern wanted it to be what he called an experiential history lesson with an explicit narrative. And it's composed much like a symphony, a score with 4 movements. There's a continuous 12-foot wall that surrounds and frames the rooms on one side. The first room deals with the Depression. There are life-size sculptures by George Siegel, including a bread line of 5 men, where people line up behind it and have their pictures taken, perhaps imagining themselves in that circumstance. The next term is dedicated to his. Sorry, we went too fast there. Okay. The next term is in fact dedicated to his second term and the multiple accomplishments of the New Deal. You have to get close to read things and in fact touch. You can touch the monument, touch the walls. The hands you see there are burnished by people in fact touching the monument. The next room, the third room, is the Room of War, and the seated sculpture of FDR after passing through a series of stones inscribed with his exclamation, "I hate war." The 9-foot image is approachable, unlike, let's say, the sculptures of Jefferson and Lincoln. The pose is grand, but his dog Fala is sitting behind him. He's a larger-than-life figure, yet on the other hand, people go up, it's intimate and close, and in fact, people stand there and hold his hand. It's rather remarkable. In what may be described as a middle period in his career, this reconstituted smaller office, one of the first projects was the corporate headquarters of the Levi Strauss Company, nestled at the base of San Francisco's iconic Telegraph Hill, only blocks from the Halperin Office. The hill abuts one side of the plaza, the bay beckons on the other. The project's bifurcated into 2 segments, a hard surface plaza bounded by angular brick buildings and a green pastoral park. The park and plaza are deftly united. In his first sketches for the design, he made notes of a combination of mountain, grottos, and falls. He described it as a 3-dimensional collage of water and planting. Both sections feature water gardens, but of dramatically different types. The source of the water is a grand fountain, water emerging from stone. In the plaza, it's out of a huge block of granite from the High Sierra, and water cascades over the lips of a monolith before finally swirling into this beautiful circle. In looking at the works in the archive, one of the things that struck me was this little series of sketches, and there were many, many more. And it's important I note this for students. People think designers just pop things out of their head. There were scores of alternatives for Levi Strauss Plaza. For those you know, the lower part, sometimes it had no water. Sometimes it had a big lake. Sometimes it had a rectilinear lake. He explored, and you can find this in all of his designs, a basic thing that explored and massaged and understood a myriad of ways to try and understand the project. All of you who are designers understand this well. Those who are not designers should recognize this. It's critical. Okay. In the park section, the waterfall then cascaded into a series of stepping stones recalling Japanese gardens, and then the water seemingly passes underneath the Embarcadero towards the San Francisco Bay. In Los Angeles, he reunited with Charles Moore, with whom he had collaborated on Lovejoy Plaza and Sea Ranch in the design of the exuberantly postmodern bunker steps, but across the street, the more subdued additions to the McGuire Gardens fronting the city library. You'll hear more about this later. Throughout all of these professional incarnations, Halpern worked in Israel, the location of his only significant built international work. He designed the Central Plaza for Hebrew University's Givat Ram campus. In Jerusalem, he designed the entry promenade and the Ida Crown Plaza of Israel's modernist Israel Museum. But for years, he would channel his energies into the Armon Hanitziv project, on a hill overlooking the old city of Jerusalem, creating a design of lasting significance. The views from the hill are spectacular. From his first notes, he wrote, he was taken by the incredible view, perhaps the most awe-inspiring urban view in the world. There's a quality of the ageless urban landscape quality that's ineffable. The city and landscape must be made an organic whole. The view must be kept in all our planning, not only the ridges and slopes. A great promenade is enough, a great piece of theater. The project became known as the Haas Promenade, locally called the Tayelet, which is an Israeli, a Hebrew term which has combinations of a Mediterranean corso, an urban boulevard, a promenade, and a belvedere. The Haas Promenade is in fact a grand belvedere in a literal meaning of the term, offering a beautiful view oriented towards the old city of Jerusalem and always on access to the Dome of the Rock in the distance. The shape of the land is it was a grand amphitheater, accentuates the arc of the promenade. On the right, the image you see on the right is just one page of his notebooks, and a remarkable combination, because if you look at that, there's a cross-section of the entire design looking out towards the old city. There's a detail of the wall. There's the specifics of materials. There's dimensions, all looking from the macro to the micro scale. The next phase, the project, would be done. That project, by the way, was done with Shlomo Aronson, Israeli landscape architect who had been a student of Halperin's and worked in his office before returning to Israel. The next stage of the project was done with the Goldman Promenade with Ruth Levin, who had been a student, had worked with him in San Francisco before establishing his own practice in San Francisco. A key thing about this design, which you see on the left, this project was entirely designed in the field through a series of sketches. Despite health problems, he remained active into his 80s and produced some of his most mature work, all in his beloved Sierras and San Francisco. He was called upon to design the entry path to Yosemite Falls, the major attraction, of course, in that national park. It was a rare late-in-life opportunity to return to the Sierra landscape, to return to the Sierra landscape that had played such a significant role in his life. While his designs were always choreographed, in this one he took this scenographic approach. The drawing you see here is him in the field doing a design for that pathway, which you see the drawing on the right, and on the left is that actual pathway. Okay? I took that picture before I saw his drawings. In other words, it was clearly such a significant site in the design. Okay. The project, as I said, was entirely designed in the field. He transformed the path and recognition of constantly keeping the view of the falls in the distance. But he analyzed the place as he had analyzed the falls and places in the Sierras, using the primary material of the Sierras, stone. Okay? His drawing showed a typology of Yosemite's boulders, stones and walls, freestanding, flat stone stacks. He in fact supervised the placement of every single stone in the design, all of which frame small fragments resonated the grand concrete monoliths that frame the valley and act as the spillway for the falls. This is a stone garden, recalling the inspiration for his art that he'd written about years ago in Gardens of the High Sierra. Okay. Along with his contemporary Ian McHarg, Halpern was the great promoter and proselytizer of the role of landscape architecture and its significance of environmental design. He understood the value of communication in the public and the profession. He wrote books, had articles, exhibits, talks, and appearances, and his posthumously published autobiography, A Life Spent Changing Places. As the landscape architect Laurie Only said, Larry changed how landscape architecture's practice and how it's understood today. What characterizes his work? His most significant contributions as a designer? The picture on the left, Anna Halpern said, was her favorite photograph of him. His aesthetic was founded on a Bauhaus education, but unlike many who were influenced by the Bauhaus stylistic aspects, he also incorporated its agenda of social reform and the idea that design could positively impact society, a pragmatic idealism. The works derive from intense personal experience. It's passionate and idealistic. He was of his times, yet a trailblazer. He worked at all scales, yet excelled as a site designer, the maker of memorable places. His designs aspired to an engagement, a multi-sensory kinesthetic pleasure of walking through places and literally climbing and into designs and fountains and plazas, where being out of doors is primary. While the work may be seen as modern, it also strives for an archetypal quality, much as sought by his contemporary Louis Kahn. Halpern saw his art was intuitive, built upon what he said were myths, symbols, and basic primitive ideas of what humans are like. The work is deeply embedded in California and the American West, in spirit and lifestyle. His love of both stone and water and his fascination with their interaction is dramatic. It's present in his drawings of Sea Ranch and the Sierras. The polarities of hard and soft, stone, the most solid of materials, water, the primordial liquid with its infinity of properties. It's tempting to see these as metaphors for his work. The stone representing the stability of form, the creation of a structure in which experience happens in almost a liquid manner, taking on the shape of its container. You're a witness and a participant in a performance, the concept he held so dear and how he evaluated the success or failure of a design. One of his last works was Stern Grove. It is a masterpiece in stone where the quality he most desired, creating a place for performance, is the raison d'etre of the design. Conceptually, design is simple. A stage fronts a green meadow and a terraced stone amphitheater enclosed on all sides by a forest backdrop. Gradually descending from the meadow are low-rise steps, alternating rows of grass leading to larger stone terraces. The terraces are meticulously constructed. Each stone had been carefully placed and cut. Seemingly random, individually placed uncut stones give the impression that they tumble down the hillside. Steps are cut across the grain of the grove's contours, a warp and weft in stone. The upper stone terrace merges into the forest amidst terraces that resemble where vertical stones resemble a sculpture garden. The entire design feels simultaneously archaic and contemporary, as if an overgrown forested site had been discovered and restored to a new use. A common first impression is that it resembles Machu Picchu. On seats, on terraces, picnicking on blankets, over 12,000 persons can attend a Stern Grove summer performance. For the opening of Stern Grove in 2009, and shortly before his death, Anna Halpern choreographed the performance, Spirit of Place. The stage and amphitheater were inverted. On a rainy afternoon, the audience stood on the stage while the performance took place among the stones and terraces. The work was personal, a gesture from wife to husband in honor of their years of collaboration. She said, "Something I wanted to do for Larry." One can see in the Stern Grove's design the germs of ideas that were tested a half-century ago on the dance deck in their Marin County home. Thank you. I assume those applause are as much for Larry Halprin as me, but thank you very much.